weekly for our Meet the Artist Talks, a series that is made possible by a generous grant from the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation. And tonight we are delighted to have artist Elizabeth Pedinotti Haynes with us. Before I introduce Elizabeth, I just want to make a few quick announcements. As the summer is winding down, we're looking forward to a full, exciting season of fall classes. So please go to cpw.org for more information. We have a great listing of offerings, including classes like the photo pamphlet, Photo Book 1, Making a Book Dummy, and Photoshop Fundamentals, just to name a few. They're all online, and you can flag us down with questions later if you like. And a note that the current exhibitions are closing on Sunday, this Sunday. So please come back and spend some time with Larry Fink, Flashpoint, and the Rose before they come down. And finally, before I get to the intro, please join us again next week on Thursday, September 4th for Meet the Artist with Brenda Ann Keneally. And she'll be presenting the work of participants from her month-long personal storytelling and bookmaking workshop. The accompanying exhibition is in the community gallery right now. It's called Photographs, Scotch Tape, and Our Heart's Desire. And we'll have an opening celebration reception for everybody in that show before the next MTA. So 4 p.m. next Thursday, and it'll continue a little bit after the presentation as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'm very happy to be introducing Elizabeth Pedinotti Haynes, whose beautiful work, Juniper Tree, is currently on view in the Rose, the back gallery. Go after her, check it out after she's told you more about her practice. But her work is concerned with the detritus, physical and metaphysical, of the everyday, and its entanglements with the expectations, with role-playing, and with the myths of domestic life. Her most recent project, Family Table, was selected for a solo exhibition at the 2025 Copenhagen Photo Festival. She was just in Copenhagen for that, and will be the subject of a monograph published by our friends at St. Lucie Press in the spring of 2026. She was recently awarded a fellowship residency at Saltonstall Foundation for the Arts in Ithaca, New York, and a Discovery Award at the Encontros da Imagem Festival in Braga, Portugal. There is also, I just saw, a beautiful zine on sale there. I'm sure Elizabeth will tell you more about it, but you can pick it up after the talk. I will be buying one. So everybody please join me in welcoming Elizabeth.
Good evening. Sorry, I can't see with my glasses on or off. I'm not sure this is going to work. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really nervous. I'm just going to start with that. I am so excited to be here at CPW. This is the third or fourth time I've been here this summer for a variety of things. But I think one of the most incredible things that I have attended here was the opening of the Rose show that's in the back. So if you haven't had a chance to see that show, it is coming down on Sunday, and it's such an honor to be a part of that. It is an incredible show, and Marina and Justine have done such an amazing job with it. So if you haven't, please take a minute and look through, because you will not regret it. Okay, so I was going to present my zine, Memory Basement, tonight, which I do have for sale here if you're interested in checking it out. That was what I was originally going to do, but I decided instead to try something different. I'm going to be really vulnerable with you and start off trying something brand new. I'm going to read you a story I wrote very recently and show you images to accompany my reading that are an experiment in a sort of asynchronous parallel narrative. I'm interested in exploring the associative powers of the human mind, particularly in contrast to an algorithm or an artificial intelligence. How are the abilities of the human brain and body uniquely equipped to draw connections based on impulses, emotions, empathy, memories, moods? I'm just beginning to work this sequence out here, so it might be really bad. But I'm very interested in your thoughts after the presentation, if you have any. And I will follow this reading up with a more traditional talk too, so don't worry. This story that I'm about to read you is about 10 minutes long. The hedge. She shifted flatter onto her belly as he passed, feeling the cool ground on her skin as it spread out over the dirt. She tucked her head back behind the ferns too, but it was really just out of habit. She knew this youngster, and he knew her, as most of them did by now. Relaxing her eyes, she felt a warm sideways beam of an afternoon light bathe the right side of her face, brilliantly swallowing details into swaths of light and dark, dappling movement across the grass. Her left eye remained in shadow, adding to this dizzying, flattening effect. Lately, she spent most of her hours observing the light as it changed, second by second. She had learned to isolate the dip in temperature as the sun slipped behind a cloud, the move in color from warm to cool to warm again. She had memorized the movement through time, the modulations in weather, and the shifts in seasons by the changes in light and shadow. She visualized her route through the tunnel, under the hydrangea, behind the grapevine, between the ferns, in and out of the woodshed, and around the corner, behind the raised bed where the arugula seeds had fallen and rooted themselves in her own private patch. Just waiting for that sticky sun to slide a bit lower in the sky. This had been her territory for ages, since well before her last child left her, and she'd known somehow that there would be no more. She'd had 56 in all. 28 of them lived to move out on their own, most of them leaving without saying goodbye. It was exhausting anyhow, and if she was honest, there was always a bit of relief to come back and find them gone. Once they were ready anyway, once they'd had a fighting chance. Their memories stayed with her in images, the sleeping naked children curled up together for warmth, their sweet scent, their sightless blue eyes. She'd named the first ones. She had just left her own mother not 3 months before and was enjoying a run, stretching her legs and feeling the cool dew on her body as she loped through the long grass. When she turned to ask the male why he was following her, he'd punched her hard in the face. Reeling from the blow, he had mounted her before she knew what was happening, holding her down and thrusting into her, eventually tumbling sideways with a pathetic little cry. Bolting for the safety of the hedge, she slept for a long time. Upon waking, she felt a carnal hunger. Feeding became a new kind of pleasure. The way the flavors exploded in her mouth, she'd eaten everything she could. The light colors, the dark colors, the flowers and the stems. By the time she was overtaken by the urge to nest, she was already quite heavy and could feel them wriggling beneath her skin. Her first nest was haphazard at best. She felt panicked and unsure, not fully aware of why she was even building it. Something deep inside her was guiding her actions, but its call was weak, and her anxiety mostly drowned it out. She'd found a tall patch of grass and began smoothing it out, digging a small hole at the base and pulling the hair from her backside to line it. Before it was finished, she'd felt her legs give out beneath her and her abdomen contract in waves of blinding pain. When the waves stopped and she stood, there were 3 tiny babies beneath her. She was awestruck at how they found their way to her nipples and drank from her with ease. As her milk let down and into their warm mouths, her body was awash with a heavy sort of love, tinged on every surface with something new. Once they had had their fill, she covered them with the fur and fled off to the hedge to stave her own growing hunger. A delirious exhaustion called her to sleep in the soft, fragrant pine needles under the evergreen hedge. As she drifted, she saw them clearly behind her eyelids, her 3 pink little babies, and she named them Lena, Jessie, and Thomas before losing herself completely in an inky black sleep. When she awoke, the light was already waning. Her body was so heavy with milk that it hurt to move. She lumbered upright and gently moved along the perimeter of the garden until she could see the edge of the nest. The evening was beautiful, the sky was pink, and fireflies were shyly exploring their first few flickers. There were 2 little wrens pilfering the fur from her nest and using it to build their own. As she approached, they scattered with great gobs of it in their beaks. As she moved closer, she realized something was wrong. She couldn't catch their scent. The nest had been torn wide open by something clumsy and rank. Its scent was everywhere. Her babies, save a trace of blood here and there, were nowhere to be seen. Her knees buckled. She lay in the shallow nest-turned grave and prayed for the thing to come back for her too. Eventually, overcome by hunger and a weak but persistent will to live, she dragged herself back to the hedge and ate. That was the only time she'd name them. After that, if they survived to the point of leaving the nest, she asked them to choose their own. This resulted in some strange names, as you can imagine, since they were only 28 days old and still very much children. Many of them named themselves after flowers or their favorite greens. She'd had a few lilies and roses, fennels and chives. There were also several poops, a couple of buttheads, and even a truck, but she didn't argue. It had been the first step in relinquishing responsibility for the precarious life they had ahead of them, and she'd had no choice but to do it. After the catastrophe, she decided that if she couldn't avoid having babies, she would make sure she at least gave them the best chance she could. When approached by a male, she learned to take the first shot, punching him as hard and fast as she could to see if he would falter, only mating with the ones that would stay on their feet. At first, she felt timid and reticent to cause them pain, but over the years, she began to relish the violence, beating them with such a fury she surprised herself. Her nest building was exquisite. She dug multiple chambers deep into the soil and smoothed them out with care, choosing the most sheltered and hidden corners of the garden. She marked all the safest territories diligently and fought off everyone else who tried to challenge her. She never strayed too far again, keeping close watch over her babies from a safe distance as often as she could. And when they were big enough to learn, she taught them to fight. She taught them to think on their feet. She told them the truth about the things they might face and how to best face them. Still, the tragedies were too many to name. Weed whackers, peregrine falcons, foxes, badgers, owls, late frost. The worst were the dogs because they weren't even hungry, at least not for food. The most violent events still sometimes flashed across her mind in disjointed strings as she was drifting off to sleep. The sound a newborn makes when in distress is something that is impossible to forget. But that was long enough ago that it is becoming softer around the edges. She is the oldest one left in the garden. Most die or leave after a year or two, but she has now been through 5 full rounds of seasons and had her last babies more than 2 seasons ago. When time began to stretch itself out for her in a way that was so unfamiliar, it had been empty at first. What was she to do if she didn't have babies to prepare for, protect, and care for? 3 to 5 times a year since she was mature, this had been her life. The first time a male passed her by, she was awash with relief. She began to sit quietly and listen to the sound of her own heart beating. She observed the birds and squirrels and insects and invented incredible stories about their lives. She watched the raindrops land on the surface of the paths and rebound slightly into the air before they fell again. She sought out the delicate impressions that the wren's feet and robin's feet made in the mud after a storm. At mealtime, she ate one type of green and then another, taking in the distinct flavor of each, trying to determine if the clover from the sunny part of the yard tasted different than the clover from the shady part. Occasionally, someone would pass through who called her mother, and something would warm up inside her that she thought was long extinguished. They would remember her more clearly than she remembered them, but their stories were familiar, and their eyes were filled with love. She didn't know their names, and so called them all child. Sometimes they would bring her things. Sometimes they'd ask for something. They never stayed very long, and when they left, it was always evening, the safest time to travel. She would sit in her pine-scented hedge, watching them leave via the route she'd shown them as babies, through the tunnel, under the hydrangea, behind the grapevine, between the ferns, in and out of the woodshed. With the sun beaming into the hedge, She would let the light burn into her eyes just long enough, leaving an after image of her child as it moved away from her in quick and careful movements, a liquid silhouette against the sun. Okay, so that's the story. My work has always existed in thresholds, in the spaces between memory and imagination, consciousness and subconsciousness, interior and exterior. As of late, I've become increasingly curious about things that are classified in response to these thresholds. For instance, if something ceases to exist, does it become a memory, or is it now in the realm of the imaginary? In speculative and often absurd ways, I'm exploring imaginary and otherworldly narratives that exist alongside my own. I'm interested in a sort of magical realism that blends natural and mythical spaces and breaks down barriers around what it means to be alive. My visual artwork and writing address memory as something constantly being constructed, disassembled, and reassembled based on shifting perspectives. In my earliest work, I was already interested in domestic scenes, images that were grounded in the mundane or everyday, but felt somehow unfamiliar at the same time, and hinted at a narrative in a single frame through movement, oblique angles, or unusual props. This is an image I found from my senior project as an undergrad. I was shooting medium format, black and white film, and I was obsessed with, like probably all undergrads, Sally Mann, Ralph Eugene Meatyard, and also Dwayne Michaels. I wasn't sure at this time if I wanted to be a painter or a photographer, and I was working really hard at both, but I was getting a lot more better feedback on my photography. I think my love of painting influenced my work as a photographer and still does. I painted portraits and took photos after undergrad, as well as teaching high school photography classes and waiting tables. And by the time I decided to apply to grad school, I had kind of let painting go and was exclusively working in photography. I was photographing cohabitating people separately in their homes and asking them to tell me what it was like to live with the other person. I then stitched the negatives together. I was intrigued by how their aloneness stayed intact, even though the final photograph showed them sharing the frame. I think I was interested even back then in understanding shared memories and intimacy, and how acts of sharing and nurturing, creating space for connection and for pleasure, can also reinforce boundaries. I was also looking at the mechanics of the image and how much I could get away with as far as depth of field and focus, the direction of light, doubling of objects, distortion, and still be believable as a single image. I was working on this just before Kelly Connell's project and monograph Double Life was released into the world, which is a much more beautiful and conceptually sound use of a similar technique, except she photographs herself as a character in a relationship with herself. If you aren't familiar with this work, it's incredible, and I highly recommend checking it out. But this project did get me into grad school, so that was good. These are my parents. They're here tonight. This is myself and my sister, Sarah, who is an incredible artist. You can look her up on the gram, Lip Talk. This next project was another attempt at grasping at the substance of memory without relying on facts or actual events, and in a way ending up elaborating on fictional narrative that further confuses a history or timeline. These were elaborately created tableaux of childhood memories that existed vividly in my mind, despite being something I'd never remember actually experiencing. These were the results of stories I'd been told, and as I began to insert myself inside these events, I realized that the child mind that had absorbed and created these narratives was lacking in context and understanding of the context. Often the images ended up being of moments just before or after the event in question. The memory or the event itself was proving too slippery to hold on to. This is the aftermath of my hair catching on fire when I was blowing out my birthday candles on my 5th birthday. I realized that often my memories were actually the result of injecting myself into other people's stories. For instance, I hated Brussels sprouts and used to hide them on my lap, but really it was my mother who hated lima beans and hid them under the table. Some of these mundane events took on an eerie feeling, perhaps in part due to a striking lack of details in the background of the images. My siblings and I used to pile all of our stuffed animals in bedding and jump off the refrigerator while my parents were sleeping, which would be the event that I would remember or try to remember. But the lack of details hint at the fact that this is a memory and not an actual event taking place. My mother caught on fire while making tea and holding my baby sister. Photographed from an oblique perspective, a child's point of view maybe, or a fly on the wall, might be another reason these mundane acts become strange even in their familiarity. Apparently, I used to purposely drop my ice cream cone so I could have my dad's larger one. Some became stand-ins for the many miracles my grandmother claimed to have witnessed. This is drool in the shape of the Shroud of Turin. Inanimate objects started to take on a life of their own in the form of a hyperbolic feeling, such as the amount of sand in your bathing suit after a day at the beach as a kid. I started to think about the domestic spaces and objects outside the memory space as playing a simultaneous role in the narrative. This is a weeping olive. Beetles doing it in the cabinet when no one was looking. I also became interested in other ways that time was recorded in a photographic sense. For instance, thinking about mold as a record of time passing, a way of record keeping. What is the physical memory of a strawberry? What part of that strawberry is imprinted on the mold? Flour holding the impression of fingers, the way light leaves an impression on a piece of film or a sensor. The traces left from milk evaporating as a sort of momentary physical memory or photographic trace of the act of heating milk. This tree shows the physical memory in the form of an outline of a building that was knocked down the day before. I became interested in domestic objects as stand-ins for handed-down ideologies associated with domestic labor and assigned gender roles. I was also making a lot of video work at the time. This is a piece that was at a show I had at the Slot Foundation Gallery in Philadelphia. Let's see if I can play this. And then this happened. I had my kids in a 19 months apart, and for about 3 years, I only took pictures on assignment. I had paper taped down in my house in a few places where interesting shadows came in, and I traced the shadows several times a day. It was like a caged animal. I read and wrote a lot of poetry, but caring for 2 babies at once really threw me, and then that led right into COVID, which was another time warp. During lockdown, I started to turn the camera back on myself and my family, mostly to document my superb nursery design skills and housekeeping skills. I wanted to formalize the way time sped up and slowed down at the strangest intervals. I also started to feel like my children and I were changing so rapidly that the ghosts of our former selves were still occupying or haunting the spaces that we inhabited. I wanted to understand what it meant that I was nostalgic for the moment that I was currently in. I also started to feel the presence of my actions as a parent, my recent memories of interactions with my family, memories of being parented, my fears about the uncertain future that my children were entering, all as palpable figures occupying the home alongside us. I started to call these figures monsters, and the monsters could occupy any or all of us, or any inanimate object or space at any given moment. I read Cruel Optimism by Lauren Berlant at this time, and it really affected the way I started to think about the ideas of success and intimacy. Cruel Optimism by Lauren Berlant refers to a form of attachment or hope that remains desirable but is ultimately harmful or unfulfilling. It describes a paradox where people cling to certain fantasies, promises, or expectations, such as the idea of happiness, stability, or success, that sustain them emotionally, but also trap them in cycles of disappointment and vulnerability. This type of optimism can be cruel because it keeps individuals striving for ideals that are increasingly out of reach, often at the expense of their own well-being. The monsters in my domestic environment became our optimistic attachments in a way, the things we were chasing that could ultimately be our undoing. Cruel optimism helped bring into focus the importance of recognizing the imperfect, fragile nature of human existence and finding ways to create moments of connection, joy, and meaning outside societal pressures, economic challenges, and personal challenges. My photographs became a conversation between my domestic space, my children, myself, and the monsters that occupied us all, with the ultimate goal of maintaining hope without clinging to false ideals and accepting the persistent ambivalence and imperfections. Sometimes the monsters were exhausted as I was. I began to see intimacy as an ongoing, often imperfect negotiation that reflects broader social and emotional realities. Moments of intimacy often reveal the limits of what can be truly shared or understood, and that the pursuit of intimacy can both be a source of comfort and frustration. This is me wearing all of my sweaters at the same time. It's sort of an expression of excess and an absurd shield against unknown or imagined dangers, and perhaps a protection against the frustration or vulnerability of intimacy itself. The challenge of living in a moment that isn't defined by an optimistic attachment beyond my reach has become a part of my everyday practice. Consistently failing at it is another part of my practice. The monsters appeared in the form of supposedly harmless, commodified fake animals. The monsters were often collaborations between my kids and myself. Jesus made a few reappearances in random places. My grandmother came back to haunt us a few times. The monsters were ultimately not a threatening force, but rather a resistance to swallow herd-determined realities of parenting and domestic life. They were both a temptation to react to the prodding from the world that we were only going to be safe if we followed a certain path and if we got in line and acted in ways that were least threatening to the status quo, and a resistance to take things at face value. They were an embodiment of my resistance to being housebroken. There was a desperation to these monsters that was a desire to take up space in a more authentic form. And the more I opened myself up to the idea of them, the more I saw them everywhere. They were interventions in the status quo. They were an invitation to reinvent or circumvent our parent-child relationship to allow for a greater sense of agency for all of us. Even the Bacon-desired agency. My images often walk this line between tenderness and torture or terror and play, and I believe this threshold is asking the viewer to examine their own ambivalence. There is nothing explicitly threatening per se in the images, but intimacy is not always idyllic. It can be intertwined with discomfort, dependency, or disappointment. And we are all living with a shadow version of ourselves at all times, and are all capable of imagining our own potential for violence. What kind of anger or pent-up frustration or twisted sense of humor or insanity is required to nail green tomatoes to a wall? Though we know this is a fork, why is there something terrifying and claw-like about it when it lurks in the shadow? Tension is a threshold between two states, a place where energy can be contained only temporarily. There is also a reimagining of what a mothering energy is and how motherhood is a fluid state of being that is not mutually exclusive to those who give birth. What if you could glean a family recipe directly from the tomato itself? Could covering my stomach with my child's hair teach me something about being an 8-year-old boy? Could I siphon energy from Mother Earth if my exhaustion was deep enough? This was the first time I cut an image out of a photograph and used it inside another photograph. This was in response to a piece of writing I did about my grandfather. I had heard my parents say affectionately over the years, "Oh, there's Grandpa Fred," every time we saw a blue jay, and I was confused by the conflicting reference and tone. My grandfather died when I was 5 and had been a difficult man. He had not made things easy for my parents. I also knew blue jays were asshole birds, known for stealing other birds' nests, eating other birds' eggs, so this tracked. But the tone with which they referenced him was so generous and sweetly nostalgic. I was struck by this fragile but hopeful gesture, this acknowledgement of his imperfectness without an attempt to sweep his difficult nature under the rug. The idea of using cutout images alongside objects in a sort of still life became very intriguing to me. This opened up the ability to create worlds where things seem familiar enough to draw in the viewer, but strange enough to signal that something was amiss. The ability to collapse time and scale in on itself, the way memory and dreams often do, was so compelling to me. This allowed me to borrow from the long history of still life painters, particularly early 20th century women. Those are a reference to Carrington's Staffordshire dogs in there. And formalist photographers I love, such as Jan Groover. But I could bring in my own set of symbols and references, including paper cutouts and trash, processed foods, disposable flatware, and create a sort of hybrid art studio / dining table space where the objects themselves are free to function outside their assigned roles and use values. At the time, I was finding myself deeply engaged with domestic labor with an intensity I had never expected. This was a way to find a remove, to reimagine and reinvent my space and its occupants in a way that expanded beyond the taskiness of daily life. Using many iterations of the same form to change or reassign or reduce its usefulness as a tool or object and increase its presence as an object to engage with. It was a way of bringing together the familiar, but out of scale and out of sequence, creating a space in which a viewer could begin to orient themselves, but not quite. I started to think about the liberation of the domestic interior and all its inhabitants from our handed-down histories and herd-determined roles and trajectories. At this time, I read Noor Al-Sadir's Animal Joy. She speaks of animal joy as a joy rooted in the body, in the sensory experience of being alive, often in defiance of reason or structure, an exuberance in the body's raw, unmediated interaction with the world. For Al-Sadir, this joy is paradoxically linked to moments of vulnerability and openness. It is not a kind of joy we can control or perfect, but one that bursts forth from the animality of our being. Alcidir suggests labor in its most sensual form can be a site of animal joy, a form of connection that transcends reason or structure. There is something deeply sensual in preparing a meal, feeling the textures of vegetables, the warmth of food as it's served. The act of care, while a form of protection, is also a way of connecting, one that is visceral and embodied, something that doesn't need words to be felt. And yet, there is always a feeling of ambivalence, a knowledge that the demands of care can also reinforce boundaries. The tasks of mothering often feel like a delicate negotiation between protection and truth. What is it that we keep from our children for their own protection? And what are the things we withhold that they actually might need to understand themselves? As I pass meals across the table, wash dishes, or chop onions, I feel a certain isolation in the very acts that are meant to bring us closer. They are loving gestures, but they are also acts of withholding, keeping things in order, controlling what can and cannot be shared. I find this tension mirrored in the way my children navigate the world and wonder what might be lost in the pursuit of a structured, ordered existence. There is an authenticity to life, a joy that comes from perfection, not from perfection, but from messiness, from a kind of unguarded being that is too often suppressed by the very things we are told we need. There is a strong systemic and economic motivation to keep us optimistically tethered to a cruel system for the benefit of the system and its very few beneficiaries. As I engage with my own children in their lives, I find myself yearning for this more instinctual joy, something unpolished, something alive in its imperfection. But there is also the recognition that this joy, too, requires space to exist. It is the very act of making space, whether on a counter, in a photograph, in an economic system, or in a relationship, that allows us to feel connected to the rawness of the world. The fork is an important symbol. It is a utilitarian object, an object that civilizes us, keeps our hands clean, has been mass-produced in all kinds of materials, but it is also easily a weapon, and in the case of my work, a flying thing, a giant thing, a limp thing, a twisted thing, a dancing thing. If we can imagine a different use value for a fork, then we can imagine a different use value for ourselves. Through often absurd and iterative methods, my work is making space by changing the meaning and trajectory of the subject it beholds. By using a form of collage, I am taking apart and reassembling the physical and metaphysical space of my life, memory, and imagination to be something expansive and flexible. A space that allows for mistakes and do-overs and asking unanswerable questions. I am searching for a way to occupy these liminal spaces, those moments of joy and frustration, of intimacy and distance, of care and isolation. My photographs are an attempt to capture these moments of transformation, where something could shift or disappear at any given moment, and transform them into places of possibility. These are worlds where small, ridiculous acts of transgression can chip away at the status quo. My images often serve as a screen for acknowledging fear, potential loss, re-imaging the past in a new way, an incantation for the future, or a request for a do-over. They are meditations on things left unsaid. They are amalgamations of dreams and reality. The monsters are still there in this work, but they are met with curiosity. They are representative of the associative nature of memory, when things come together that normally wouldn't or shouldn't. They are symbolic representations of close bonds and secrets, of autofictions and parallel dimensions, and a way of harnessing, processing, and role-taking in the aftermath of chaos. They are an attempt to embrace moving parts, the sort of fragmented nature of memory, and the fits and starts of changing bodies and minds. They allow us to become wonderfully, horribly monstrous. They merge and unmerge characters from real life and literature, such as the juniper tree, empathizing with and embodying characters in extreme situations. This is the piece which is in the show, The Rose, curated by Justine Kurland and Marina Chow, and it's specifically inspired by the Grimm brothers' fairy tale, The Juniper Tree, which, if you haven't read it, is a very dark story that begins with a mother's tale of a desperate desire for a child, and it quickly devolves into a tale of greed, murder, gaslighting, cannibalism, magical transformation, and ultimately revenge. These worlds hold a variety of potential moments. Instead of a linear sense of time, they allow for moving forward and backward, learning and unlearning. Through playful slips, reimagined roles, and expanded possibilities, and by shifting assumptions and confounding expectations, I'm seeking new ways to be in conversation with the thresholds of photography and collage, family and self, domesticity and wildness, memory and truth, and word and image. And I have one little combination of some stop motion for you. Okay. And this is an image from my zine Memory Basement that I have for sale. It's a combination of images and a short story. And it's over here if you'd like to purchase one after. That's all I have. Thank you. Any questions? Well, no, I shoot both digital and film. I shoot medium format, film, and digital. I prefer to shoot on film, but it's really expensive and time consuming. And I live in Saratoga Springs, so I have to like mail my film to the city and then get it back. So it's like really complicated. And then I do a combination of strobe and natural light. Like this is done with a strobe. Yeah, but I love natural light. It's just, you know, we live in the great dark Northeast, so sometimes it's not available. And some of the earlier stuff was large format film.
Can you talk about the collaborative process between yourself and your children and how that process represents both your individual identities and your sort of shared identity?
That's a great question. Yeah, so I mean, I think when they were younger, the collaboration was more like, oh, they're doing something really strange and awesome, and I'm going to get involved in this in a way, you know, and like try to not direct it, but figure out how I can make a good picture out of it. And now that they're a little older, it's more, I mean, they bring me things a lot. They're like, this is like a really gross thing that you probably want to put in a photograph. You know, like they're always thinking about my work, which is really awesome. And they are, I'm constantly photographing them. I'm really interested in like their movements, you know, like the way that their movements have changed over time. And so they're really happy to move for me and let me photograph them that way. And a lot of the things that I write about have to do with events. Like the story that I read you, that came out of our dogs. actually getting into a bunny nest and destroying all the bunnies except for one, and then having to take this little dying bunny to a bunny rescue because my son was so distraught over it that I knew it was going to die, but we drove it like 30 miles to this bunny rescue because, you know, this is what he needed to do in order to feel like he tried to do something. And I feel like a lot of the collaboration is sort of really trying to honor their impulses and not parent over them, I guess, or not like override them. Yeah, and also thinking about, like, you know, in the case of like this juniper tree image. So, I mean, you can see my kid's head and like leg, and I mean, the kid actually gets decapitated in the juniper tree story. His head, and that his stepmother chops his head off with a. The Grimm fairy tales are gruesome, but I actually think, you know, there's a lot of gaslighting that we do to kids that's like in this Grimm story, and so I feel like in thinking about having them around to kind of help me reflect on some of those things, I think is really helpful in making my work. So I don't know, does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
As your brother, I'm curious about Jesus showing up in the coffee grounds at one level, and other things travel and clearly seems to be kind of ironic and sort of, you know, poking fun in some ways at the sense of, you know, divine manifestations in everyday life. But I think at another level, there's something a little more complicated going on there, where maybe there's a kind of allusion to the notion that the miraculous does still pervade the ordinary, and there's this kind of dual-edged aspect of that, or like kind of like a post-Catholic or post-Christian sense of the miraculous, where you're still kind of haunted by those aspects of the past. I just wanted to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm definitely like a recovering Catholic because that's how we grew up as kids. And I think my grandmother was a big influence on me as a kid because she was so into it. I mean, she was really holy. But I also am very interested in the idea of the things that we think we know as human beings, and what we understand to be human consciousness, and how we sort of privilege that over other forms of consciousness. And I think a lot of times in my work and in my writing, particularly when it comes to like animals and other living creatures, I wonder sometimes if we might do better if we didn't always privilege our own consciousness over other beings. And so I don't have like any sort of dogmatic beliefs in any of those things, but I feel like I'm very, very open to a lot of different sort of forms of spirituality, or of synchronicity in particular. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but Jesus just appears to me because Jesus is I think Jesus is kind of a funny character. So he comes back again and in the bacon and in the, but yeah, I mean, I just wrote a story about the Order of the Poor Clares, and that's the Franciscan, the sort of female version of the Franciscan monks, but they're actually earthworms in this story. And so I definitely am affected by that Catholic upbringing, for sure. Yeah. Yes?
How old are your kids now?
My kids, my youngest just turned 10 last week, and 10 and 11.
And what is their relationship to art that they never had?
What is their relationship to art? They are like brilliant artists. They're the kind of kids who, like, when you give them a coloring sheet, they turn it over and like immediately start drawing on the back. They're totally nuts. They're like really very creative and really amazing, and they just kind of follow their impulses. They like to build things and make things and sculpture, and they love to tell stories.
Well, I can see in the collaboration with them that, you know, I think that's very liberating. Yes.
I hope so. I hope so. Thank you. Serena?
Question, and I know this is maybe this is obvious. You started this sorority and you talk a lot about how literature and text informs your work. But I was curious if you could speak a little more to that. You also seem to have the active writing practice on this edition. And I was thinking about even those memory pieces, the memory photographs, really like language prompts of it, right? Like something is in the form of this memory, in the form of this false memory, right? In the form of this language, it's like playing in your head and becomes this picture. So I don't know, I just was wondering more, like, if you could articulate a little bit more of the connection is, and then also a lot of these pictures are informed by like mythology, or if it's just every now, you know, it's sporadic.
Yeah, yeah. Well, so let's see, there's a couple of parts to that answer. I read a lot, and I feel like my work is always influenced by what I'm reading. Sometimes like very directly influenced by what I'm reading. Has anyone read the book We Do Not Part by Han Kang? Okay, so you need to read this book because it's beautiful, and if I could write a book like this, I would just die happy. But that book is another book I was reading at the same time that I read The Juniper Tree, and The Juniper Tree was also, I'm going to forget the author's name, but it was made into a longer story by a woman who, she wrote a novel-length version of The Juniper Tree. So I feel like I go down these rabbit holes where I start to read, I'll read something and then I want to read something else that's sort of an offshoot of that. And so like this piece was influenced by the Grimm fairy tale, but it was also influenced by this longer novel version of The Juniper Tree, and how, and also this other novel that was very experiential and had a lot of references to birds and memory. And I feel like all of my pieces are like that. So if I were to go through and like, I could bore you to death with all the references in all of these pieces, but there's not really anything that's not influenced by something that I have either written or read. And sometimes the work then, then I'll make a visual piece and then that will inspire me to write something else. So I feel like the process kind of goes back and forth. But I really am interested in like how these sort of, how do I say this? How these sort of stories and characters kind of can haunt the images in a way, can kind of exist in layers within the images. And so in some ways, I think I couldn't make these if I didn't have a story or a narrative in mind. So in some ways, I think my writing it kind of comes first before the images do, even if it's just something that I'm writing in my mind at the time, or a story that I'm thinking, a narrative that I'm thinking of, or a news story that I heard. I mean, in some cases, like this piece I made the day that Donald Trump was elected for the second time. So this is sort of more topical, I would say. But in some ways, and it was sort of more of an emotional, I think, response. But even then, it was still in response to an event. And I think, the fire and the crowns of maple leaves and all of those things are sort of references to these kind of like historical, mythical figures. So yes, I don't know. And then what was the other? You had another part of your question, I feel like. Or did I answer it all? Okay. 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 Anyone else? Yes. Oh, that's a great question. I think it's both. I collect a lot of things, and sometimes I don't use them for a really long time. Like I'll find something and I'll be like, this is a really important object to me. Try to think of something that is a good example of that. See if I can find something like that. Like I'll find like a hawk feather or something. That's a good example. And I won't know what I'm going to use it for a really long time, but I have like a collection. I have an insane collection of objects and things that I feel like are important. But then also other times I am envisioning the image in my head as I'm reading or writing, and then I have to find those objects. And then a lot of times I will create something like, like this is an image that I made where my son was really the main part that I thought of ahead of time, like photographing him with these bananas. And but then I felt like it needed something else, and so there are all of these pieces of leftover food. I hate the waste food, so sometimes I'll just take, like, if my kid doesn't eat his bagel, I'll just save it and I'll put it in a photograph, and at least that way I feel like I used it for something. So I always have a collection of like scraps of food or like leftover things in my refrigerator on the counter that I am going to use in a photograph. Yeah, I don't know. This, let me go back to this one. It's like way in the beginning, but this is even, it's kind of a sad example, but let's see if I can find it. It's like the first thing. So this mouse, my husband accidentally killed it by trying to save it, and I needed a picture of it so that I could use it in a photograph, in an image, so that I could feel better about the fact that we accidentally killed this mouse. So those are some of the things that I collect. I grew only peppers this year in my garden because I had no time and it's wild. So I have a lot of peppers. So that's why there's a lot of peppers in my work, because we will never eat all of these peppers, but they're going to be used somehow or another. I don't know if that answers your question or not. But. Anyone else? Thank you very much. Oh, I have one more thing. I have a book that will be coming out sometime in 2026 with St. Lucie Press. And if you would like more information on that or anything else, I have my notebook over here, which is open for your name, if you would, an email address, if you'd like to be put on my mailing list. I will need to do some pre-sales for this book to come out. So if you're interested in surprise print sales or pre-sales of the book or any other news. I promise I won't send you too many emails, but you could put your name down, and that would be wonderful. We can keep in touch. Thank you very much.